The wheat was the color of a dead man's hair, and it moved in the wind like something breathing. Dylan Reeves stood at the edge of his rooftop garden with a Canon R5 on a tripod and a chef's knife in his back pocket, and he watched the combine harvester crawl across Harold Knox's south field like some prehistoric beetle feeding on the earth itself. Mid-June in Ohio, and the air tasted like dust and cut grain and the particular sweetness of a world that did not yet know it was ending. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and checked the monitor. The shot was good. Golden hour light spilling across the raised beds of tomatoes and basil and the heritage carrots he'd planted in April. And behind him the two-story farmhouse sat solid and white against the sky, and the solar panels on the south-facing roof threw back the sun like mirrors laid out for some pagan ceremony. "All right, guys," he said to the camera. "Day 214 of the homestead. We're pulling the first of the Danvers carrots today, and I'm thinking a roasted carrot soup with that sourdough we baked on Tuesday. Farm to table in about 90 minutes. Let's see what we got." He pulled a carrot from the soil and held it up. It was fat and orange and perfect, and he could already see the thumbnail, could already see the comments rolling in, the subscribers clicking. 1.2 million of them now, and the algorithm loved him because he was the real deal. Not some trust fund kid playing farmer. He'd done his time in the kitchens. He'd 12 years on the line, 2 years under Jean-Luc Moreau at Étoile in Chicago, where he'd learned to break down a whole lamb in under 4 minutes and plate a tasting menu for 60 without breaking a sweat. The Michelin star had been Moreau's, but the hands had been Dylan's, and everybody in that kitchen knew it. He'd traded all of it for 40 acres in rural Ohio and a YouTube channel, and he had not looked back. Not once. The homestead was everything he'd built it to be. Solar array, deep well with a hand pump backup, root cellar packed with canned goods and vacuum-sealed proteins, chicken coop, greenhouse, the kind of setup that made preppers weep with envy, and he'd documented every square foot of it for the camera. The radio on the potting bench crackled, something about a variant strain overseas, and he'd been half hearing these reports for a week now. Some kind of aggressive flu burning through coastal cities in Japan and South Korea. The talking heads couldn't agree on whether it was airborne or bloodborne or just the usual media hysteria that sold ad space. He turned the volume down and kept filming. From somewhere beyond the wheat field there came a sound, high and thin and wrong, like a dog being stepped on, except it wasn't a dog and it didn't stop. Dylan lowered the camera and listened. The combine had gone silent. The sound came again, and this time it was clearly human and clearly terror, and it cut through the summer air like a blade drawn across glass. His phone buzzed. A message from Patricia, his cousin in Tokyo. She was a correspondent for Reuters, and she did not scare easily. The message was a video on 32 seconds. He watched it standing there in his garden with the carrots at his feet and the evening light going gold to copper around him. A woman in a business suit on a street in Shibuya. She was on her knees over another woman, and she was biting. Not fighting, biting. Tearing with her teeth at the other woman's throat, and the blood was very bright on the white blouse, and the woman doing the biting had eyes that were wrong. Not vacant, not crazed, just white. Like the iris and pupil had been erased and replaced with milk. Patricia's text beneath the video read, "This is real. Get ready." Dylan laughed. He actually laughed, and stood there in his beautiful garden on his beautiful homestead and laughed the way a man laughs when the universe presents him with something so absurd that the only honest response is to reject it entirely. Then he watched the video again, and a third time, and the laugh dried up in his throat like water on a hot skillet. He went inside and found Mia at the kitchen table with her laptop and her spreadsheets. She was tracking their quarterly expenses against the channel revenue, and she had that look she always got when the numbers weren't cooperating. The look of a woman who had spent 8 years at Deloitte making corporations money makes sense, and who now applied that same terrifying precision to counting jars of pickled beets. "We need to talk," he said. "The carrots?" "Not the carrots." He showed her the video, and she watched it once with no expression, and then she closed her laptop and looked at him and said, "How much rice do we have?" That was Mia. No panic. No questions about whether it was real or fake or what it meant for the broader geopolitical landscape. Just inventory. Just numbers. He loved her for it, and sometimes it scared him, and right now it was exactly what he needed. 200 pounds, maybe 220. Flour? 60 pounds, plus whatever Harold's got at the mill. Ammunition? He paused. Not enough. Joy came down the stairs in her pajamas with a book about butterflies pressed to her chest. 8 years old and quiet in the way that some children are quiet. Not shy, observant. She looked at her parents and she looked at the phone in her father's hand and she said, "What's wrong with that lady's eyes?" Dylan put the phone away. "Nothing, baby, go back up." "They looked like eggs," Joy said. She said it the way she said everything, like a fact, like an observation filed away for later use. Then she went back upstairs and Dylan listened to her footsteps on the old oak treads, and he thought about how those footsteps were the most important sound in the world and how he would do whatever was necessary to keep hearing them. He spent the next hour on the internet. The domestic live streams were worse than Patricia's video. Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh. Shaky phone footage of people running and people falling and people who had stopped being people doing things to other people that Dylan's brain kept trying to categorize as special effects. And the comment sections were a mix of prayer and profanity and conspiracy theories, and he scrolled through them with the same clinical detachment he'd once used to read Yelp reviews of restaurants where he'd worked. He called the neighbors. Most didn't answer. Old Mrs. Bellamy down Route 7 said she'd heard something about a quarantine in Columbus, but her TV wasn't working right. The Hendersons weren't picking up. Harold Knox's line went to voicemail, and in the background of the recorded greeting you could hear the combine running and the wheat falling and the world still turning the way it always had. He was standing at the kitchen window when he saw it. Out past the fence line where the wheat started. A figure. Standing still at first and then moving, jerking, and like a marionette being worked by someone who'd never seen a human being walk before. It was Dave Pellegrino from 2 farms over, and Dave was a big man, 6'3" and 240, and he'd played offensive line at Ohio State back in the day. Now Dave was lurching through the wheat with his arms at wrong angles and his head cocked sideways, and even from 100 yards Dylan could see that Dave's shirt was dark with something that wasn't sweat. Dave reached the edge of Harold's field where 2 farmhands were loading equipment onto a flatbed. Dave hit the first one at a dead run and took him to the ground, and the sound that came across the field was not a sound that belonged in the world Dylan had woken up in that morning. Dylan locked the front gate. He locked the back gate. He pulled the emergency shutters on the ground floor windows, and he went to the gun safe in the basement, and he took out the Mossberg 500 and the Ruger 1022, and he loaded them both, and he set them on the kitchen table next to Mia's spreadsheets, and he looked at his wife and said, "We're not leaving this house." Mia nodded. She opened a new spreadsheet. She titled it, Inventory. Outside, the screaming had stopped. That was worse. Part 1. First bites. The morning came gray and wrong. No combine noise, no birdsong, just the wind moving through the wheat in a silence so total it felt like pressure against the eardrums. Dylan hadn't slept. He'd sat at the kitchen window with the Mossberg across his knees and watched the darkness and listened to the radio until the local station went to static at 3 a.m. And then he'd listened to the static because even that was better than the quiet. Mia slept for 2 hours in the chair beside him with her head on her arms at the table. Joy slept upstairs. He checked on her twice. Both times she was on her side with the butterfly book open on her pillow and her breathing slow and steady. and he stood in her doorway and felt something in his chest that was too big for his ribs to hold. At first light, he went to the rooftop garden and glassed the area with the binoculars. The wheat fields stretched flat and golden in every direction, and they looked the same as they always did, except for the dark shapes scattered through them. Some were lying down, some were standing. The standing ones weren't moving, they were just there, planted in the grain like scarecrows put up by a farmer with a sick sense of humor. Harold Knox's mill was visible a quarter-mile east, the big stone building with the wooden water wheel that hadn't turned in 20 years, but that Harold kept maintained because he was that kind of man, the kind who believed in preserving things. The door was open, and from this distance Dylan could see something dark smeared on the threshold. "We need flour," Mia said behind him. She'd come up without him hearing. She did that. And yeast, and whatever medical supplies Harold kept. "You see what's out there?" "I see approximately 11 stationary figures in the visible field, none between here and the mill. The path along the irrigation ditch provides cover for most of the route." He looked at her. She'd already mapped it. He'd already run the numbers. He wanted to tell her that this wasn't a spreadsheet, and that the things in the field weren't line items, but he knew she knew that, and he knew her way of knowing it was to turn it into data, because data was how Mia survived, and it always had been. "I'll go alone," he said. "No. You'll need someone to carry while you cover." They argued about it in whispers on the roof while the sun came up orange through the haze, and the standing figures in the wheat didn't move and didn't move and didn't move. In the end, Mia won because Mia always won arguments that involved logistics. Joy would stay locked in the basement with the Ruger and a walkie-talkie and strict instructions not to open the door for anyone whose voice she didn't recognize. And Dylan took the Mossberg and a canvas duffel and the 8-inch Wusthof chef's knife that had been with him since culinary school. He'd broken down 10,000 chickens with that knife, filleted more fish than he could count. It was an extension of his hand. An old friend. He slid it into the leather sheath on his belt and felt something settle in him. Not calm, exactly. Just readiness. They went out through the back gate and along the irrigation ditch. The morning was cool and the grass was wet and the world smelled like it always did in June. Like growth, like things becoming. The wheat on either side of the ditch stood tall and golden and moved in the breeze, and Dylan kept his eyes on it the way a man watches water he knows has sharks in it. They made it to the mill without incident, and the door was open and the dark smear on the threshold was blood. A lot of blood. It had pooled and dried to a brown crust, and there were drag marks leading inside, and Dylan's stomach did something it hadn't done since his first day in a professional kitchen when the sous chef had cut his thumb off with a mandolin and just stood there looking at the space where it had been. Harold was inside. Harold was 68 years old, and he had owned this mill for 40 years. And he had ground wheat and corn and rye for every family in the county, and he had been a good man. A quiet man. The kind who'd bring you a sack of flour when you moved in and never mention it again. Harold was on the floor behind the counter, and he was still alive, but he was not Harold anymore. Something had bitten him, and the wound on his forearm was ragged and deep, and the flesh around it had gone gray-green, and his veins stood out black against his skin like rivers on a map of somewhere no one wanted to go. He was breathing in short, wet gasps, and his eyes were open, but they were filming over, going white. "Harold," Dylan said. The old man's head turned, slow, mechanical. The eyes found Dylan, and there was a moment, a half-second, where Harold was still in there, where the man who'd ground the wheat and told bad jokes about corn and lived his whole life within 10 miles of where he was born, looked out through those clouding eyes and recognized the young man standing over him. "Go," Harold said. The word came out broken and wet. "Go now." Then the eyes went all the way white, and Harold's jaw unhinged in a way that human jaws were not designed to unhinge, and he lunged. Dylan swung the Mossberg stock first and caught Harold across the temple, and the old man went down and then came back up immediately like he'd bounced off the floor, and Mia screamed and Dylan pumped around and fired, and the sound in that small stone building was enormous. Harold dropped. Harold stayed down. And the silence that followed was worse than the gunshot because it was the silence of a line being crossed that could never be uncrossed. "Get the flour," Dylan said. His voice sounded like someone else's. Mia moved. She was shaking, but she moved. So she filled the duffel with 50-pound sacks of wheat flour and rye, and she grabbed the first aid kit from behind the counter, and she stuffed her pockets with packets of yeast, and all of it mechanical and precise like she was fulfilling an order at a warehouse. The gunshot brought them. Dylan heard them before he saw them. A rustling in the wheat, not wind, movement, deliberate and convergent. They came through the back door of the mill, 3 of them. Mrs. Henderson from the next farm, her teenage son Kyle, a man Dylan didn't recognize who was wearing a FedEx uniform and whose lower jaw was missing. Dylan fired twice. Mrs. Henderson went down. The FedEx man went down. And Kyle Henderson came through the gap between them with the speed of a high school wrestler, which was what he'd been 6 days ago, and Dylan didn't have time to pump another round. So he dropped the Mossberg and pulled the Wusthof, and he did what 12 years in kitchens had trained his hands to do. He cut. Clean and fast and precise. The blade went through the boy's throat, and Dylan felt it hit the vertebrae, and he pulled, and the boy fell, and Dylan stood there with his dead neighbor's dead son's blood on his hands and the knife dripping and his breath coming in hard, short pulls like a runner at the end of a sprint. "The duffel," he said. "I have it. Go. Now." They ran. Back along the irrigation ditch with the wheat moving around them and the duffel banging against Mia's back. More sounds in the field now, more movement, in things rising from where they'd been lying, things turning toward the noise. Dylan fired the Mossberg twice more without looking back, and each time the boom rolled across the flat Ohio landscape like summer thunder. They were 50 yards from the back gate when they heard the voice, a woman's voice, coming from the wheat to their left. "Please, please help me. Oh God, please." Dylan slowed. "Don't," Mia said. "Someone's alive in there." "We don't know that." The voice came again, ragged, desperate, real in a way that tore at something fundamental in him. He could see a shape in the wheat, a hand reaching up through the stalks. "Please. My leg is broken. Please don't leave me." Joy's face flashed in his mind, the sound of her footsteps on the stairs, the butterfly book on her pillow. And the math was simple, and it was brutal, and it was the first moral equation he'd ever solved that he wished he could take back. He had a wife and a child behind a locked gate, and he had 4 rounds left in the Mossberg, and every second he stood here, the things in the field were getting closer. "We have to go," Mia said. He went. He turned his back on the voice in the wheat, and he went. The screaming started before they reached the gate, high and wild and terrible. It followed them through the gate and through the yard and into the house, and when he locked the door behind them and sat down on the kitchen floor with blood on his hands and his chest heaving, the screaming was still going. And then it stopped, and the stopping was worse. Joy came up from the basement. She looked at the blood on his hands and the blood on the knife and the flour dust on Mia's clothes, and she said, "Did you help them?" Dylan looked at his daughter. "Help who, baby?" "The person screaming." He said nothing. He went to the sink and washed his hands, and the water ran pink and then clear, and he watched it spiral down the drain, and he thought about all the things he'd cut in his life and how none of them had ever made him feel like this. The radio in the living room was still on, static mostly, but every few minutes a fragment of broadcast would break through. Words like quarantine and National Guard and shelter in place and unprecedented. and he sat with his family in the kitchen, and they ate canned soup cold from the can because no one wanted to cook, and outside the infected roamed the roads of their little village in Ohio, and the world as they had known it continued its slow and irreversible dissolution. That night the infected tested the fence for the first time. 3 of them, pushing at the chain link with that mindless persistence that was somehow worse than rage. Dylan watched them from the upstairs window with the Mossberg, and he didn't fire because ammunition was a finite resource and because the fence held. The infected pushed and moaned, and their white eyes caught the moonlight, and they looked like pilgrims who'd arrived at a shrine they didn't understand. At dawn, they drifted back into the wheat, and Dylan added fence reinforcement to the list Mia had started on the kitchen whiteboard. The list was already long. Part 2. Stockpile Gambit. Mia's inventory took 6 hours. She went through every room of the house and every shelf of the root cellar and the garage and the greenhouse, and she wrote it all down in a notebook with the same handwriting she'd used on audit reports at Deloitte. Neat, precise, merciless. The numbers were both encouraging and terrifying. 218 pounds of rice, 62 pounds of flour counting what they'd taken from Harold's mill, 47 jars of canned vegetables, 31 jars of preserved fruit, 80 pounds of dried beans, 12 pounds of salt, a gallon of cooking oil, 18 cans of tuna, 24 cans of chicken broth, spices, sugar, coffee. Enough to feed 3 people for approximately 4 months if they were careful, and for 2 months if they weren't. The solar array was producing at 80% capacity. One panel had cracked during a hailstorm in May that Dylan hadn't gotten around to fixing. The deep well was functional. The hand pump backup was functional. They had water. What they didn't have was medicine, some basic first aid, ibuprofen, bandages, hydrogen peroxide. But no antibiotics, no prescription drugs, no surgical supplies. In the old world, this had been a 15-minute drive to the CVS in town. In the new world, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. And ammunition. The Mossberg held 5 rounds and he had 43 left in the box. And the Ruger was a .22 and he had maybe 200 rounds. Enough for small game, not enough for a sustained defense against anything determined to get through the fence. "We need more," Mia said. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open and a calculator and the expression of a woman who was looking at a balance sheet that didn't balance. "Medicine, ammunition, seed stock for fall planting if we're going to be here that long. We're going to be here that long. Then we need seed stock." Patricia called that afternoon. The connection was terrible. She was still in Tokyo and the city was falling apart around her, and she talked fast because she didn't know how long the cell towers would stay up. "It's not a flu," she said. Her voice kept cutting in and out, but the fear came through clear. They're saying it started in a food processing facility. Something in the grain supply. The mutation jumps through bites, but the initial vector was ingestion. The incubation period is... The line went dead. It came back for 3 seconds. Anywhere from 6 hours to 2 weeks, depending on... Dead again. Then nothing. Dylan stood in the kitchen holding the phone to his ear and listening to silence and thinking about the word ingestion and about the 62 pounds of flour in his root cellar and about the bread he'd baked 2 days ago that his whole family had eaten. He put the phone down. He didn't tell Mia about the ingestion part. Not yet. There were too many variables and not enough data, and panic would not help anyone. This was something he'd learned in the kitchen. When the grill goes down during Saturday service and you've got 40 covers working and the sous chef is looking at you like the world is ending, you do not panic. You assess. You adapt. You keep your hands moving. The internet died at 4 p.m. The cell towers followed by 6. The landline lasted until midnight, and then that was gone too. The silence that replaced them was total and immense. No hum of servers, no distant buzz of commerce and communication and 10 billion souls connected by invisible threads. Just the wind and the wheat and the things in the field. Connor Locke showed up the next morning, and he came walking up the county road with a backpack and a camera bag and a DJI Mavic drone in a case slung across his chest, and he looked like a man who had been walking for a very long time and who had seen things along the way that had rearranged his understanding of what was possible. Dylan saw him through the binoculars from the rooftop. A young guy, late 20s, skinny, wearing hiking boots and a flannel shirt, and the particular expression of someone who is too exhausted to be afraid anymore. "Don't let him in," Mia said. "He's alive." "He's a stranger." "He's alive, Mia." Connor stopped at the gate and stood there with his hands visible and his voice cracking when he called out, "Hey! Hey, I can see you up there. My name is Connor Locke. I'm a photographer. I've been walking from Pittsburgh. I have water and a drone, and I'm not sick and I'm not crazy, and I really need to not be outside when it gets dark." Dylan went down to the gate. He didn't open it. He stood on his side with the Mossberg and studied the young man's eyes. Not white, clear and brown and terrified. "Pittsburgh," Dylan said. "What's left of it?" "What's left of it?" Connor's face did something complicated. "Not much." Dylan gave him a bottle of water and 3 energy bars through the fence. Connor sat on the ground outside the gate and ate like a man who hadn't eaten in days, which he probably hadn't. He talked while he ate. About Pittsburgh burning. About the bridges clogged with abandoned cars and the infected moving through them like shoppers at a mall. About the National Guard units that had set up at the convention center and then hadn't been heard from again. About the drone footage he'd shot from the roof of his apartment building that showed the city from above, and how from up there it looked like someone had kicked an anthill, except the ants were people and some of them weren't people anymore. "I've got footage," Connor said. "Everything I've seen. The drone can map a 10-mile radius. Battery's good for another 6 flights. That information is worth something." Mia had come down and was standing behind Dylan. He could feel her calculations running. The cost of another mouth against the value of aerial reconnaissance. The risk of a stranger against the tactical advantage of a drone that could show them what was moving in the fields they couldn't see from the roof. "One day," Mia said. "He sleeps in the barn. He doesn't come inside. He shares everything the drone sees." "Deal," Connor said. "Absolutely, whatever you need." They let him through the gate, and Dylan showed him the barn and gave him a sleeping bag and a can of beans. And the young man sat on a hay bale and looked around at the solid walls and the roof overhead, and something in his face crumpled and rebuilt itself. And Dylan recognized it because he'd seen it in the mirror that morning. The look of a man recalibrating his relationship with safety. That evening, Mia sat across from Dylan at the kitchen table after Joy had gone to bed, and she said something that landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "The Vita grows samples," she said. "What about them?" "The ones Agricor sent, the food company. It's your sponsor." "I know who Agricor is. They sent a sample batch of their new grain products. Enhanced wheat flour, enhanced protein bars. It was part of the sponsorship deal. I logged the shipment 3 weeks before the outbreak. I ate one of the bars. Joy ate one. I put the rest in the cellar with the regular supplies." Dylan looked at her. And Patricia said the initial vector was food processing, grain supply. The silence between them was very large. "Probably nothing," Dylan said. "Probably," Mia said. But she wrote it down in the notebook. She wrote down everything. That was her way. The power flickered at midnight, went out, came back, and went out again for 11 minutes while Dylan stood at the breaker panel with a flashlight and swore quietly. And Mia sat in the dark with the Ruger, and Joy slept through all of it because children can sleep through anything until one day they can't. The infected came at 2 a.m., more than the night before, 7 or 8 of them pushing at the chain-link fence where it met the front gate. The fence bowed inward and the posts groaned, and Dylan stood at the window with the Mossberg and waited. If the fence came down, he would fire. If it held, he would wait. Ammunition was a number on Mia's spreadsheet, and every round spent was a subtraction that could not be undone. The fence held. Barely, and in the morning he could see where the posts had shifted in the concrete and where the chain link had stretched, and he added steel reinforcement bars and concrete mix to the whiteboard list, and he looked at that list, and he looked at the wheat fields stretching empty and golden to the horizon, and he understood with a clarity that felt like a physical weight that this was his life now. This list, this fence, this family. Everything else was gone. Part 3. Barricade Blues. He started with the windows, quarter-inch plywood from the garage backed with 2x4s screwed into the frame, every ground floor window sealed. The front door reinforced with a steel bar he pulled from the old barn beam, the back door same. He worked in the heat with a battery drill and a box of 3-inch screws, and the sweat ran down his face and soaked his shirt, and he didn't stop. Mia handled the perimeter. She ran wire from the solar array to the fence line and rigged a crude alarm system using tin cans filled with pebbles. Anything that hit the fence would rattle the cans. Low-tech, effective. The kind of thing you'd see in a military field manual, except Mia had never read a military field manual. She'd just done the math on what they had and what they needed and arrived at tin cans. Connor flew the drone at dawn on his second day. The footage was worse than they expected. The village proper was a mile south, and from 300 feet up it looked like a photograph of a place that had been a place and was now something else. Cars and ditches, and a building burning with no one trying to stop it. Dark shapes moving in the streets with that distinctive lurching gait. The feed store had its doors open, and from the drone's camera they could see shelves still stocked. "I could go in," Connor said. They were watching the footage on his laptop in the barn. "Quick run, in and out, grab what's useful." "No," Dylan said, "there's hardware in there, wire, tools, maybe ammunition." "I said no." "It's your call. I'm just saying the door's wide open and I count maybe 4 of them in the immediate area." "You counted 4 from 300 feet up through a camera lens. You don't know what's inside. You don't know what's around the corners. You go in there and you die, and then I've got a dead photographer and a drone with no pilot. Math doesn't work." Connor shut up, and he was learning the language of the new world. In the new world, the math always mattered, and sentiment was a luxury that cost calories, and calories were numbers on Mia's spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet did not care about heroism or compassion or the particular way guilt felt at 3 a.m. when you couldn't sleep. The storm came on the 4th night, not a bad one by Ohio standards. Wind and rain and some thunder, but no tornado warning, and in the old world, Dylan would have sat on the porch with a beer and watched it roll through. In the new world, the storm meant 2 things. First, the noise would mask the sound of infected approaching the fence. Second, the solar panels were exposed. The wind took panel number 7 at 2 a.m. He ripped the mounting bracket clean off and sent the panel sailing into the yard, where it shattered on the concrete path. Dylan heard it from inside, and his gut clenched because that panel was 6% of their power generation. And 6% was the difference between running the well pump and not running the well pump, and not running the well pump meant no water, and no water meant death. He had to go out. There was no choice about it. He put on the headlamp and took the Mossberg and went out through the back door into the rain and the dark and the wind. The remaining panels were flexing in their mounts, and he could hear the brackets straining, and he had to get up there and tighten them or they'd lose more. And he climbed the ladder to the roof in the rain with the drill in his belt and the shotgun slung across his back, and he was halfway up when he heard the cans. The tin cans on the south fence rattling, not wind, not rain. The particular pattern that meant weight against wire. He got to the roof and looked down and saw them. 5 of them at the south fence, 4 more coming out of the wheat. They moved through the rain with their mouths open and their white eyes catching the lightning, and they were beautiful in the way that natural disasters are beautiful. terrible and indifferent and absolute. He tightened the brackets, panel by panel in the rain, with his fingers going numb and the drill bit slipping and the infected pushing at the south fence 20 feet below. He could hear the posts groaning, could hear the chain link stretching. One of them found the gate latch and started working at it with the blind persistence of water finding cracks in stone. He finished the last bracket and climbed down and went to the south fence with the Mossberg and fired once. The one at the latch dropped. The others didn't react to the gunshot the way he expected. They didn't scatter, they didn't flinch. They turned toward the sound and they came, and he fired again and again, and then he was pumping an empty chamber, and the last two were at the fence and the fence was giving, and he pulled the Wüsthof and went to work. The first one came through the gap where the chain link had separated from the post. It was a woman. It had been a woman. Dylan didn't look at her face. He'd learned already not to look at their faces. He cut and the body fell, and the second one came through and he cut again and it fell on top of the first. And he stood there in the rain with the knife and the blood and the water running down his face and his left arm burning where something had torn through his sleeve and scored the skin beneath. He looked at the wound. A scratch, not a bite, not deep. But it was bleeding and the rain was mixing with the blood, and he thought about infection vectors and incubation periods and about Patricia's broken voice saying ingestion. And he cleaned the wound with hydrogen peroxide that burned like justice. And he wrapped it with gauze, and he told himself it was fine, and he mostly believed it. In the morning he repaired the fence with wire and stakes, and he counted his remaining ammunition. 29 shotgun rounds. 187.22 rounds. The math was not encouraging. At the current rate of engagement, he had maybe 2 weeks of defense. After that, it was the knife and the pitchfork and whatever else he could swing. The radio picked up a broadcast at noon, a military frequency, clipped and professional and hollow. All civilian shelters in Zone 7 are at capacity. Federal relief convoys delayed indefinitely. Citizens are advised to shelter in place and conserve resources. God bless America. Then static. Then nothing. Mia erased government help from the whiteboard. She replaced it with self-reliant. The word had always been there in everything they did, but seeing it written in her neat hand on the white surface of the board made it real in a way that felt like a door closing. Dylan dreamed that night. He dreamed of the voice in the wheat field, the woman asking for help. In the dream, he went to her. He pushed through the stalks and found her lying there with her leg twisted under her, and her face turned up to him, and she was Patricia, and she was Harold Knox, and she was Kyle Henderson, and she was every person he had failed to save, and she looked at him with eyes that were not white but clear and brown and terrified, and she said, "Why didn't you come back?" He woke up in the dark and went to the window and looked out at the fence and the fields and the shapes standing motionless in the moonlit wheat, and he thought about the word strategy and how it was just a polite way of saying the things you decide not to care about. Part 4. The Quiet Crop. 2 weeks in and they had a routine. Routine was everything. Routine was the architecture of sanity. Dawn, Dylan checked the perimeter. Every inch of fence, every post, every join. He walked it with the Mossberg and the knife and the methodical attention of a chef doing mise en place before service. Everything in its place. Everything accounted for. Morning, Mia ran the numbers, water usage, caloric intake, power generation, ammunition count. She updated the spreadsheet on the laptop they kept charged via solar, and she presented the daily briefing at breakfast like a CFO reporting to a board of directors, except the board was a 35-year-old chef and an 8-year-old girl, and the company was a farmhouse in Ohio, and the quarterly projections all ended with the same word, which was if. Midday. Rooftop garden. Dylan and Mia tended the beds while Joy helped. Tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs. The seeds had gone in before the outbreak, and now they were growing with the cheerful indifference of plants that do not know and do not care that the world has ended. Dylan found comfort in the growing, in the green, in the simple mechanical truth that soil plus water plus sun equaled food. This was the equation that predated civilization, and it would outlast it. Afternoon, maintenance, repairs, improvement, always improvement. There was always something to fix or reinforce or build. The homestead was good, but it wasn't perfect, and perfection in the new world wasn't a luxury. It was the margin between alive and dead. Evening. They ate. They talked. Sometimes. Joy drew pictures in a notebook. Mia updated the ledger. Dylan sat at the window and watched the fields. Night. Watch. Dylan took first shift. Mia took second. Connor, who had stayed past his one day and was now into his second week because Mia had calculated that the drone's value exceeded the caloric cost of feeding him, took the midnight slot from the barn's hayloft window. It was Joy who noticed first. She was on the roof with Dylan one morning pulling weeds from the tomato beds when she stopped and pointed at the wheat field and said, "Daddy, why are those people green?" Dylan looked. The infected in the field had changed. He'd noticed it gradually over the past week, but he'd filed it under things that don't make sense and therefore I will ignore. But Joy's 8-year-old eyes saw it plainly. The infected who stood motionless in the fields during the day had developed a greenish tint to their skin. Not the gray-green of decay. Something else. Something that looked almost like chlorophyll. And their skin had a translucent quality in the sunlight. You could see the veins beneath, but the veins weren't carrying blood anymore. They were carrying something darker. Something that moved with the slow rhythm of sap. "They're like plants," Joy said. "They're not plants, baby. They're standing in the sun like plants, and they're green like plants." He watched them through the binoculars. She was right. The infected who spent the daylight hours standing motionless in the wheat were photosynthesizing. He didn't have a better word for it. They stood with their faces tilted up and their arms slightly out from their bodies, and they absorbed the sun, and they didn't move, and they didn't hunt, and they didn't make a sound. Like trees, like a crop that had planted itself. At night they woke up. At night the green faded and the hunger came back, and they moved through the dark with those white eyes and those wrong limbs, and they pushed at fences and tested doors and searched for warmth and sound and life. But during the day they were something else, something new, something that no virus Dylan had ever heard of could explain. He told Mia. She wrote it down. She wrote, "Infected exhibit diurnal dormancy. Possible phototropic behavior. Skin discoloration suggests chloroplast-like adaptation. Implications. Daylight movement is relatively safe. Nighttime is the primary threat window." "That's a hell of a sentence for a woman who majored in accounting," Dylan said. "I took 2 semesters of biology, and I've been reading Joy's science books. The butterfly one, the plant one." Dylan started the rooftop garden expansion that week. More beds, more soil, more seeds. If they were going to survive the summer, they needed yield, and if they were going to survive the winter, they needed preserves. And if they were going to survive at all, they needed to stop thinking in terms of weeks and start thinking in terms of seasons. This was what the homestead had always been for. Not YouTube content, not brand deals, not the comfortable performance of self-reliance for an audience of 1 million strangers. This, the real thing, the dirt under the fingernails and the ache in the back and the slow, patient work of keeping people alive. The chickens were still laying. 3 hens, 8 to 10 eggs a day between them. And it wasn't enough protein, but it was something. And Dylan scrambled them with wild onions from the yard and served them on plates like he was plating at étoile, because some habits die hard and because beauty in the presentation of food was the last civilized act he knew how to perform. The infected bird came on a Tuesday. A crow. It landed on the garden fence with a broken wing, and its eyes were white and its feathers had that green tint, and it went straight for the chickens with a single-mindedness that suggested the virus didn't distinguish much between species. Dylan killed it with a garden hoe. One swing, clean. But the implication sat with him like a stone in his stomach. If birds could carry it, then the perimeter meant less than he'd thought. If birds could carry it, then nowhere was safe. And if birds could carry it, then the sky itself was a threat vector, and there wasn't a fence in the world tall enough for that. He buried the bird. He checked the chickens. Their eyes were clear. Their behavior was normal. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding, and he went inside and washed his hands, and he didn't tell Joy about the bird because some truths are too heavy for an 8-year-old to carry, and because the burden of knowledge in the new world was not something you shared. It was something you bore. The gunshots came that evening, far away, south, maybe the village, maybe further. A burst of automatic fire, then silence, then another burst, then a single shot, then nothing. Connor looked at Dylan from across the yard. Someone's alive out there. Yeah. Shouldn't we? No. The false peace of the quiet days settled back over the homestead like dust after a collapse. But Dylan knew what the gunshots meant. They meant other survivors, and other survivors meant other needs and other agendas and the particular kind of danger that comes not from the mindless hunger of the infected, but from the calculated desperation of men who are still capable of making plans. Part 5. The Ledger of the Dead. Mia started the ledger on the 22nd day. She didn't tell Dylan at first. He found out when he came in from the perimeter check and found her at the kitchen table with a pile of wallets and phones and a notebook open to a page filled with names and dates and numbers. "What is this?" he said. "In data." "Whose wallets are those?" "The ones from the fence, the infected we put down last night, and the ones in the ditch by the mill." He looked at the table. 6 wallets, 4 phones, a keychain with a rabbit's foot, a laminated gym membership card. The small personal debris of lives that had ended and been replaced by something that moved and bit and stood in the sun like a plant. David Pellegrino, Mia read from the notebook. Age 44. Last credit card transaction June 14th at the Gas & Go on Route 7. Probable infection window June 15th to 17th based on Patricia's timeline data. She turned a page. Karen Henderson, age 51. Phone battery died, but the last text message was June 16th to her sister asking about the quarantine in Columbus. Probable infection window June 16th to 18th. "Why are you doing this?" "Because the data tells us who's next." He sat down. She showed him the notebook. She had mapped the infection timeline based on the wallets and phones she'd collected. Each entry included a name, an age, a last known activity, and a projected infection date. The pattern was clear once you saw it. The infection had moved through the village in a wave, north to south, following the road, following the traffic patterns. The people closest to the highway had gone first. The outlying farms had gone later, and some of them hadn't gone yet. "The Millers," Mia said. She pointed at a name circled in red. "Tom Miller. His last transaction was June 20th, 5 days ago. And if the incubation period is 6 to 14 days, then he's either already turned or he's about to. The Millers live a half-mile east. I know where they live. If Tom's infected and he comes this way, then we'll be ready, because we'll know when to expect him. That's the point." Dylan looked at his wife. The woman who had once tracked departmental budgets to the penny was now tracking the progression of a plague through their community with the same bloodless precision. He didn't know whether to be grateful or horrified, and he settled on both because the new world did not ask you to choose between contradictions. It asked you to hold them both and keep moving. He went to the old pharmacy building 2 days later, not the CVS in town, that was too far and too exposed. and the smaller place on Route 7 that had been a pharmacy in the 1990s and then a junk shop and then nothing. But the shelves might still hold something useful. Antiseptic, painkillers, maybe antibiotics if the pharmacy stock had never been fully cleared out. He went alone. Dawn, moving along the irrigation ditch and then cutting through the Henderson's back 40 where the infected stood motionless in the morning light like a garden of the damned. He moved between them, close enough to smell them. They smelled like cut grass and copper and something sweet that reminded him of overripe fruit. Their eyes were closed. Their skin was green and warm, and if he didn't look too closely, they could have been sleeping standing up. The pharmacy was a cinder block building with a collapsed roof over the back half. The front door was ajar, yet he went in with the Mossberg up and the Wusthof on his belt and his heart doing a steady 120 beats per minute. The shelves were mostly bare, picked over or just empty from years of abandonment. But behind the counter he found a locked cabinet, and the lock was old and cheap, and he broke it with a pry bar, and inside he found 3 bottles of amoxicillin and a box of surgical sutures and a tube of antibiotic ointment. And he put them in his pack and felt the kind of relief that used to come from finding a great parking spot and now came from finding medicine that might keep his daughter alive if she got a cut that went septic. The tripwire caught his ankle on the way out. He didn't see it. A thin line of monofilament strung across the doorway at shin height. When he hit it, there was a clatter of cans and a flash of light from a makeshift alarm and then a voice from somewhere above and behind him. "Don't move!" He moved. He dropped and rolled and came up with the Mossberg aimed at the ceiling where a figure was crouched in the rafters of the collapsed section. The figure had a crossbow. Homemade. Ugly. Pointed at Dylan's chest. I said, "Don't move." And I said to myself when I woke up today that I wasn't going to get shot by a guy hiding in a ceiling. Looks like one of us is going to be wrong. The figure shifted. A man, thin, bearded, eyes wild with the particular kind of madness that comes from being alone too long. That's my medicine. It was nobody's medicine, and it was sitting in a locked cabinet in an abandoned building. I locked that cabinet. Then you should have used a better lock. They stared at each other across the barrel of the Mossberg and the bolt of the crossbow. The standoff lasted 30 seconds. It ended when an infected burst through the back wall of the collapsed section. The drywall just exploded inward and the thing came through like a linebacker, and the man in the rafters screamed and fell, and the crossbow fired wild, and the bolt buried itself in a shelf of dusty magazines. Dylan shot the infected. The man scrambled up and ran. Dylan let him go. He checked his pack. The medicine was still there. He went home. That evening, Mia showed him the updated ledger. She had added projections, timelines, a map of the village with red dots where she estimated active infected and yellow dots where she estimated people who were in the incubation period. The yellow dots were clustered east and south, the Millers, the Calvins, old Frank Boyd who ran the auto shop. 3 to 5 days, Mia said, then the east side turns. How many? 7, maybe 9. And after that? She looked at the map. Then it's just us. Part 6, the child's broadcast. Joy found the radio on day 31, not the kitchen radio. The old ham unit in the basement that Dylan had bought 3 years ago for the channel. Episode 47. Building your own emergency communication setup. He'd set it up, filmed the video, and never touched it again. 2 million views. 0 practical use. Until now. Joy was playing in the basement, or doing whatever it was that 8-year-olds did in basements when the world had ended and there was no school and no friends and no internet and no cartoons. She'd been quiet for an hour, and quiet with Joy meant either reading or exploring, and exploring meant touching things. She turned it on. She didn't know what she was doing, but children are remarkably competent at manipulating electronics they don't understand, and within 3 minutes she had found a frequency and her voice was going out into the ether. Small and clear and unmistakable. "Hello? Is anyone there? My name is Joy. I'm 8. I live on a farm. We have food and water and my dad says we're safe." Dylan heard it from the kitchen, heard his daughter's voice coming through the old speaker on the counter that was still tuned to the same frequency. His blood went cold, and he was down the stairs in 4 seconds. Joy was sitting cross-legged in front of the ham radio with the microphone in her hand, and she looked up at him with an expression that mixed guilt and hope in roughly equal proportions. "I wanted to see if anyone was out there," she said. "Turn it off." "But Daddy, turn it off now, Joy." He turned it off himself, killed the power, pulled the cable, stood there in the basement with his hands shaking and his daughter looking up at him with that quiet, observant face that saw everything and understood more than any 8-year-old should have to understand. "How long?" he said. "How long was it on?" "I don't know. A little while." A little while. A little while on a ham radio with a decent antenna could reach hundreds of miles. A child's voice broadcasting coordinates of a safe location with food and water. In a world where food and water were the only things that mattered. He might as well have lit a beacon fire on the roof. Nothing happened that day. Or the next. On the 3rd day, Connor flew the drone at maximum altitude and maximum range, and the footage showed them. People. Alive. Moving toward the village from the south and east. Not infected. Survivors. Walking in small groups along the roads and through the fields. Some had children. Some had vehicles. All of them were heading in the same direction. Toward the farm. Toward Joy's voice. "How many?" Dylan said. Connor checked the footage. "At least 30. Maybe more behind the tree line." "Distance?" "The closest group is about 8 miles out. On foot they'll be here in 2 days. Maybe less." Dylan stood on the roof and looked south, and he could feel them coming. Could feel the weight of their need pressing against his perimeter like the infected pressed against the fence. Except these were people. Living people with living eyes and living voices who had heard a child say we have food and we're safe and had believed it because in the new world belief was the most dangerous thing of all. He could not feed 30 people. The math was clear. Mia had run it 6 times and each time the answer was the same. Their supplies could sustain 3 people for 4 months or 30 people for 12 days, and 12 days was not a plan. 12 days was a countdown to starvation. He could not turn them away either, not 30 of them, not families with children. Not people who had walked through the infected landscape on the strength of an 8-year-old's voice on the radio. The moral math was different from the resource math, and the 2 equations gave different answers, and in the new world you had to choose which math you lived by. He chose the resource math. He killed the ham radio permanently. Removed the antenna, dismantled the unit, and stored the components separately. Then he went to the perimeter, and he watched the south, and he waited. The first group arrived on day 34. A family of 4, man, woman, 2 boys. They came up the county road at dusk, and they stopped at the gate, and the man called out in a voice that shook with exhaustion and hope. We heard the broadcast. The girl on the radio, she said there was food. Dylan stood at the gate with the Mossberg. Even there's no broadcast, there's no food, you need to keep moving. We've been walking for 3 days, my boys haven't eaten since. I can't help you, I'm sorry, you need to keep moving. The man's face went through several stages, disbelief, anger, desperation. The woman behind him was crying. The boys stood silent with the eyes of children who had already learned the lesson that Joy was still being taught. That adults will disappoint you, that safety is temporary, that the world does not care about your hunger or your hope. They moved on. Others came after them. Dylan turned them all away. Some begged, some threatened. The one man tried to climb the fence and Connor fired a .22 round into the ground 10 feet from him. And the man fell back and ran, and Dylan stood at the gate and felt something inside him closing like a valve being shut. The worst was the group that came on day 36. 8 people, 3 of them children. They'd been attacked on the road 2 miles south. The infected had come out of the wheat at dusk and taken 2 of their group, and the rest had run, and now they were at Dylan's gate bleeding and terrified, and a woman was holding a baby that wasn't moving. "Please," the woman said, "just for tonight." Joy was at the upstairs window. She was watching. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see the people, and she could see her father standing at the gate, and she could see the baby in the woman's arms. "One night," Dylan said, and he didn't look at the window, but he knew she was there. "In the barn. You leave at dawn. You don't come in the house. You don't touch our supplies." Mia said nothing. She went to the notebook and subtracted 8 servings of rice and beans and a gallon of water from the inventory, and she wrote temporary next to the entry and underlined it twice. At dawn, they left. The woman with the baby thanked Dylan, and he nodded and watched them walk south into the wheat. And he heard the screaming start 12 minutes later. Short, sudden, then silence. Joy was at the window again, and she looked at her father, and he looked at her, and between them was a thing that had no name. A knowing, a reckoning, and the understanding that every choice in the new world was a knife with 2 edges, and that cutting towards safety always meant cutting away from something else. Joy didn't speak for 2 days after that. Part 7. The Corn Maze. The infected were learning. Dylan noticed it first in the corn. The wheat had been harvested before the outbreak, but the corn was still standing. 200 acres of it east of the property. Green and dense and 8 feet tall, and you couldn't see 5 feet into it on a clear day. It was the worst kind of terrain. Close quarters. No sight lines. The kind of place where anything could be waiting and you wouldn't know until it was on top of you. The infected had figured this out, or whatever passed for figuring out in their rewired brains had arrived at the same conclusion, and they started moving into the corn during the day. Not standing in it like they stood in the wheat, burrowing into it, digging into the soil between the rows and covering themselves with dirt and husks and going dormant underground. A new behavior. An evolution. The virus was adapting, and it was using the landscape the way a soldier uses cover and concealment. Connor found them with the drone. The thermal camera showed them as red shapes beneath the surface. Dozens of them. Scattered through the eastern cornfield like mines in a minefield. They lay in shallow trenches they dug with their own hands, and they waited. When something alive moved through the corn, they erupted from the ground. Fast, sudden, no warning. Just the soil splitting open and the thing inside launching upward with dirt cascading off its body and its mouth already open and its white eyes locked on the heat signature of the living. Connor lost the drone over the corn on the 3rd scouting flight. Something reached up from between the rows and grabbed it, pulled it down into the green, and the feed went to static, and that was that. 6 flights worth of battery and $20,000 of equipment gone in 1 second. Connor sat on the barn roof and stared at the corn and said, "Well, that's that then." Dylan made the decision at 4 a.m. on day 41. He lay in bed in the dark and ran the numbers, and the numbers told him a story he didn't want to hear. The corn was a staging area. The infected were massing. When they had enough density, they would come at the homestead in a wave that no fence and no shotgun and no chef's knife would stop. The corn had to go. 200 acres. His potential food supply for the winter. His insurance against the dwindling stores in the root cellar. 200 acres of calories standing green and tall and filled with things that wanted to eat his family. He poured gasoline along the eastern edge of the field at dawn while the infected underground slept their strange chlorophyll sleep. 5-gallon cans from the garage, back and forth along the fire break he'd cut with the brush hog. Mia watched from the roof with the Ruger. Connor stood at the perimeter with a fire extinguisher in case the wind shifted. He lit it at 7 a.m. The corn went up like it wanted to burn, like it had been waiting for this, and the flames roared through the dry lower stalks and climbed the green ones, and the smoke was black and thick, and it rolled across the flat Ohio landscape like a storm cloud laid on its side. The heat was enormous. Dylan could feel it on his face from 100 yards away, and he stepped back and then stepped back again and watched the field burn. The infected came out of the ground. They erupted from the soil as the fire reached them, rising up through the flames with dirt and corn husk cascading off their bodies and their mouths open in what might have been screams if they could still scream. Some of them ran. Some of them staggered in circles. Some of them burned where they stood and kept burning and did not fall. And the ones that ran came toward the homestead, and Dylan stood at the fence line with the Mossberg and dropped them one by one as they cleared the smoke. 7 rounds, 7 infected, clean shots. The kind of shooting you learn not in a range but in necessity, and the particular focus that comes from knowing that the things you're shooting at will eat your daughter if you miss. The fire burned for 3 hours. When it died, the field was black and flat, and the remains of the infected lay in it like dark shapes drawn on a charcoal canvas. The smoke drifted west, and the sky cleared, and the sun came down on the ruined earth, and Dylan stood at the edge of the burn zone and looked at what he'd done. 200 acres of food, gone. A winter's worth of survival calories reduced to carbon and ash. And the math on Mia's spreadsheet had just gotten significantly worse, and there was no way to make it better. And the only consolation was that the things in the ground were gone. Most of them, not all. The drone was gone, and without it they couldn't check. But the immediate threat was eliminated, and the kill zone around the homestead had expanded from 50 yards to a quarter mile, and in the new world you took your victories where you found them and tried not to think too hard about what they cost. Joy stood at the upstairs window and watched the smoke rise, and she said nothing. Part 8. The taste test. Hunger is not a feeling. It is a fact, a number on a spreadsheet, a deficit that accumulates daily and compounds weekly and eventually presents itself not as discomfort but as mathematics. Mia's projection said 63 days. That was how long their remaining food would last at current rations. 63 days and then nothing. 0. The bottom of the spreadsheet. Dylan had been hungry before, in the kitchens, working double shifts and forgetting to eat because the tickets were coming in, and the line was backed up, and the only thing that mattered was the next plate. But that was voluntary hunger, the hunger of a man too busy to eat. This was different. This was the hunger of a man who could not eat because there was nothing to eat. The chickens were still laying, but 3 hens producing 8 eggs a day could not sustain 3 adults and a child. The rooftop garden was yielding tomatoes and beans and squash, but the calories were insufficient. They were burning more than they were growing. And the deficit on Mia's spreadsheet was a red number that got redder every day. He thought about it for a week before he did it. Thought about it while lying awake at night, and while walking the perimeter in the morning, and while watching the infected stand motionless in the fields with their green skin and their closed eyes. Thought about what he knew about protein, about heat, about pathogen destruction, about the temperature at which organic material becomes safe. 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 180 Celsius, the temperature at which every living thing dies, including viruses, including whatever it was that turned people into things that stood in the sun and bit in the dark. He went out at dawn, alone. He told Mia he was checking the south fence, and he went to the burn zone where the remains of the infected lay in the ash. Most were skeletal, charred beyond use. But near the edge where the fire had burned cooler, he found one that was more intact. The heat had cooked the exterior, but the interior was preserved. He looked at it for a long time, looked at the shape of it that was still recognizably human, and thought about what he was considering, and thought about the line between survival and something else. Something that didn't have a word because the old world hadn't needed one. He cut a section from the thigh with the Wusthof. The knife went through the cooked exterior and into the meat beneath, and it was meat. That was the thing. Once you got past what it was and looked at what it was made of, it was just protein and fat and collagen, and the same components as any mammalian muscle tissue. The same building blocks he'd spent his career transforming into something beautiful on a plate. He took it back to the house. He waited until Mia was on the roof and Joy was in her room, and he fired up the camp stove in the garage and he cooked it. 400 degrees, 30 minutes. Then he probed it with the meat thermometer and it read 380 internal, and at 380 nothing alive or formerly alive could survive. Not bacteria, not viruses, not prions, not anything. He ate it in the garage standing up. It tasted like pork. He'd expected that. Long pig, the old cannibal joke. It wasn't funny anymore. And it had the texture of slow-cooked pork shoulder. And the flavor was mild and slightly sweet, and he chewed and swallowed, and his stomach accepted it without complaint. And he stood there in the garage with the empty plate and the camp stove cooling, and the full weight of what he'd just done settling onto him like a physical load. He waited 24 hours. No symptoms, no fever, no nausea, no clouding of the eyes, nothing. The heat had killed whatever the virus was. The protein was safe. The math worked. He didn't tell Mia, he didn't tell Joy, he didn't tell Connor. And he put the information away in a compartment in his mind labeled emergency only, and he cleaned the plate and he washed the knife and he went back to the rooftop garden and pulled weeds, and the sun was warm on his back. And the world was the same world it had been that morning, except that he was different in it and would be different in it forever. The nausea came later, not physical, moral. He lay in bed that night and stared at the ceiling, and his stomach was full for the first time in weeks, and the fullness felt like a stone, like something heavy and wrong sitting inside him. He thought about Étoile, about the tasting menus, about the art and craft of turning raw ingredients into beauty, even about how his whole life had been about taking the base materials of the earth and elevating them, and how he had just taken the base materials of humanity and done the same thing. And the difference between the two was everything. He went to the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror, and the man looking back was not the man who had built a homestead and a YouTube channel and a life. That man was gone. That man had died somewhere between the flour at the mill and the fire in the corn and the silence of the woman with the baby walking into the wheat. This man was something else, something harder, something uglier. Something that would survive. Part 9. The Human Harvest. Devon Hale came from the south. He came with 12 people and 3 trucks and a system. Connor spotted them first. And without the drone, he was limited to rooftop observation with the binoculars, but the trucks were hard to miss. 2 pickup trucks and a box van moving in convoy along Route 7. They drove slowly, deliberately, stopping at each farmstead and spending 10 to 15 minutes before moving on. They're organized, Connor said. That's either very good or very bad. It was very bad. Dylan watched them through the binoculars for 3 days. He watched them set up in the old grain silo complex a mile south. 4 silos, steel, built in the 60s and abandoned in the 90s when the big agricultural corporations ate the small operations alive. Empty for decades, now occupied. Devon Hale was the kind of man you'd find at a Chamber of Commerce mixer in the old world. Handsome, well-spoken, good teeth, and the kind of teeth that cost money to maintain, and that signaled to other men that their owner was a person of means and confidence. He'd been a real estate developer. Strip malls and condo complexes and the particular breed of commercial optimism that turns cornfields into parking lots. He'd gone bankrupt twice and rebuilt twice, and the bankruptcies had taught him something that the successes hadn't. They'd taught him that the most valuable resource in any economy is not money or property or equipment. It's people. And people can be acquired. Dylan watched through the binoculars as Devon's group intercepted survivors on the road. Watched the smooth choreography of it. The trucks would pull up. Devon would get out with his good teeth and his reasonable voice. He'd offer food, water, safety, a community, a new beginning. And the survivors would get in the truck. They always got in the truck. The ones who didn't want to get in the truck got in the truck anyway. It took Dylan 5 days to understand what was happening at the silos. Connor helped. Without the drone, they had to rely on ground observation. Connor was younger and faster, and he could move through the fields at dawn when the infected were dormant with a skill that spoke to either natural talent or military training. And he never said which. The people in the silos were not guests. They were inventory. Devon had them in the largest silo. 20-some people, maybe more. They came out in groups during the day to do work, farming, construction, scavenging. They went back in at night. The silo door was locked from the outside. The blood part took longer to figure out. Connor got close enough one dawn to see it through a gap in the silo wall. A setup inside, a chair, tubes, collection bags, medical equipment scavenged from somewhere. Devon was drawing blood from the captives. Regularly, systematically. His theory, as far as Dylan could piece together from fragments overheard on Connor's reconnaissance missions, was that living human blood had properties that prevented infection. That by maintaining a supply of clean blood, he could create a kind of biological insurance policy. A currency of survival. It was wrong, scientifically, practically, in every way, but it was Devon's system, and he believed in it with the fervor of a man who had always believed in his own systems even when they collapsed around him. And the fervor was convincing enough to keep 12 armed loyalists in line and 20-some captives compliant. Dylan watched from the roof, and he calculated the risk of intervention versus the cost of inaction, the distance, the firepower, the probability of success. He ran the numbers the way Mia would run them, and the numbers said the same thing every time. Stay out of it. The captives were not his people. The silos were not his problem. His problem was the fence and the garden and the 43 days of food remaining on Mia's spreadsheet. We can't just watch, Connor said. We can watch. We are watching. And that's exactly what we're doing. Those are people. And we are people. And our people are inside that house. And our people stay alive by not doing stupid things. Connor's jaw worked. He wanted to argue. He wanted to be the hero who swooped in and liberated the captives and defeated the bad guy. But the new world did not have heroes. It had survivors. And the difference between the two was measured in rice and rounds and the cold arithmetic of staying alive. A woman escaped from the silo on day 49. She came running up the road at dusk, barefoot, arms bloody, eyes wild with the specific terror of someone who has been kept and used and has finally broken free and is running without a plan because running is the only thing left. She reached the gate, and she grabbed the chain link and she looked at Dylan through it and she said, "Please. He's taking our blood. He says it keeps the sickness away, but people are dying. 3 people already. Please let me in. Please help." Dylan looked at her. She was maybe 30, thin, bruises on her arms in the pattern of restraints, track marks from the blood draws. She was shaking so hard the fence rattled. "I can't help you," he said. "You have to." "I don't have to do anything, I'm sorry. Keep moving north. Stay off the road at night. If you reach Findlay, there might be something there." She stared at him. The hope went out of her eyes like a light being switched off. She let go of the fence and she turned and she walked north into the gathering dark, and Dylan watched her go. And inside the house, Joy was at the window again, and he could feel her eyes on his back like a physical weight. Mia was in the kitchen when he came in. She didn't look up from the notebook. "The right call," she said. "Yeah? If we take her in, we advertise that we're accepting refugees. More come. We can't feed them. Conflict, collapse." "I know." "So it was the right call." "I said I know, Mia." The silence between them was different from the silences before. Heavier. Shaped like something specific. And Dylan sat at the table and cleaned the Mossberg, and he thought about the word right. And how it used to mean something clear, and now it just meant the thing that keeps us alive, and how those two definitions were not the same and might never be the same again. Part 10. The Mirror Horde. The new ones came on day 54, a different kind. The first sign was the voice. Dylan was on watch at 2 a.m., sitting in the dark at the upstairs window with the Mossberg and the particular kind of alertness that comes from weeks of insufficient sleep and constant vigilance. The infected were at the fence, 3 of them, the usual, pushing, moaning, the white eyes shuffle. Then a voice, clear, human, coming from behind the infected. "Dylan?" He froze. It was a voice he knew. Harold Knox, the old mill owner, the man he'd shot in the mill on the first day. Dead for almost 2 months now. "Dylan, son, let me in. I'm hurt. I need help." He raised the binoculars. Behind the 3 infected at the fence there was a 4th figure. It moved differently. Not the lurch, not the shuffle. Something more fluid, more considered. It stood in the moonlight and it looked like Harold Knox. Not exactly. The proportions were slightly wrong. The shoulders too wide or the neck too long. But the face. The face was Harold's face and the voice was Harold's voice, and it called out his name in the dark with Harold's cadence and Harold's Ohio drawl. "Dylan, please, the fever broke. I'm okay now. Just let me in." He almost went downstairs. Almost. The voice was that good, that real. It was that. And the part of him that remembered Harold bringing flour to the house and telling bad jokes about corn wanted to believe it. Wanted to go to the gate and open it and find the old man standing there alive and well and willing to explain that it had all been a mistake. He didn't go. He watched. The Harold thing stood at the fence for 40 minutes. It spoke in Harold's voice. It used Harold's words. It talked about the weather and the wheat harvest and the time Harold's dog ate a whole chicken and threw it up on the pastor's shoes, and it was perfect. Every detail, every inflection, like a recording played through a speaker shaped like a man. Then it went silent. And then it screamed. A sound that was not Harold. A sound that was nothing human. In a sound that Dylan heard in his chest like a bass note, and that vibrated in his teeth like a tuning fork, and that went on until he put his hands over his ears and pressed hard, and the thing that looked like Harold turned and walked back into the wheat and was gone. They came more after that, the new kind, the mimics. Connor was the first to identify the pattern. "They're copying the dead," he said. They were on the roof in the morning, and Connor was pale and shaky because he'd heard them too. In the barn, a voice calling his name in the voice of someone from Pittsburgh, someone he'd watched die. "How?" Dylan said. "I don't know how. The virus is learning, adapting. It figured out that humans respond to familiar voices, so it's using them. It's not intelligent. I didn't say intelligent, I said adapting. Like a flu that mutates to get around vaccines. This thing is mutating to get around defenses. Our defense is that we don't open the gate, so it's trying to convince us to open the gate." That night they all came. Harold Knox, Mrs. Henderson, Kyle, Dave Pellegrino. The woman from the wheat field whose face Dylan had never seen. They stood outside the fence in a line and they called out in the voices of the dead, and each voice was specific and accurate and terrible. Joy heard them. She came to Dylan's room at 3 a.m. and she stood in the doorway with her butterfly book and she said, "The people outside are talking." "I know, baby. They sound like the neighbors." "They're not the neighbors." "I know, but they sound like them." She climbed into his bed and pressed against him, and he held her, and outside the voices continued. Harold telling his dog joke, Mrs. Henderson humming a hymn, Dave Pellegrino talking about Ohio State football. An archive of the dead played back at the living with the precision of a weapon designed to exploit the one thing the fence couldn't stop. Memory. Love. Guilt. Dylan lay in the dark and held his daughter and listened to the dead call his name, and he thought about whether a man could go crazy from this. Whether the distinction between the voices outside and the voices inside his own head would eventually blur and then disappear, and then there would be nothing left but a man sitting in the dark talking to ghosts. "Daddy," Joy said. "Sure, yeah? Do you think they remember being people?" "No." "Then why do they remember the jokes?" He had no answer for that. He held her tighter and he waited for dawn, and the dawn came slow and gray, and the voices stopped when the light touched them, and the mimics drifted back into the fields, and the morning was quiet in the way that mornings are quiet after a storm or a death or the discovery of a truth you cannot unlearn. Part 11. The Seed Vault Lie. The documents were in a metal box in the basement, behind the water heater, where he'd stored the overflow from the channel's business files when Mia's home office ran out of space. Tax returns, sponsorship contracts, equipment receipts. The detritus of a YouTube career that had paid for the house and the solar panels and the deep well in the rooftop garden. And he was looking for the solar panel warranty when he found the Agricor folder. Agricor Industries, his biggest sponsor. 3 years of partnership deals, product placement in 12 videos, enhanced wheat flour, organic grain supplements, protein bars with their logo. They'd paid him $60,000 a year to feature their products, and he'd been happy to do it because the products were good and the money was better and the audience trusted him, and what was wrong with a farmer recommending farm products? The folder held the contract and the correspondence and the product specifications, and buried at the bottom a single document that he'd never opened. A technical summary. 12 pages. Dense with terminology he didn't fully understand but understood enough. The Agricor Industries had funded a research project at Ohio State University. Seed modification. Genetic enhancement of wheat varieties for drought resistance and yield optimization. Standard agricultural R&D except for the part about the viral vector. He read the phrase 3 times. Modified viral vector for genetic material delivery. The wheat seeds had been engineered using a virus as a carrier for the desired genetic traits. A common technique in biotech. Except the virus they'd used wasn't common. It was new, experimental, insufficiently tested, and the wheat grown from those seeds had entered the food supply 18 months before the outbreak. The timeline was clear. The modified wheat had been planted across the Midwest. It had been harvested and milled and sold as flour and baked into bread and eaten by millions of people, and the virus had been inert in the grain, dormant. Until it wasn't. Until some trigger, some environmental factor or mutation had activated it, and the dormant viral material in the intestines of half the country's population had woken up and done what viruses do. Dylan sat on the basement floor with the document in his hands and the light from the bare bulb overhead, and he thought about the bread he'd baked. The flour from Harold's mill. The Agricor enhanced wheat flour he'd featured in video after video after video. He'd shown 1 million people how to bake bread with the flour that had ended the world. He didn't tell Mia. He couldn't. The information was too heavy and too sharp, and he didn't trust what it would do to her numbers, to her spreadsheets, to the careful architecture of sanity she'd built around the family with her columns and her calculations. If she knew that the outbreak was connected to his channel, to his sponsorship deal, to the very flour in their cellar, the math would break. Not the numbers, the math of them, of the family, of the reason to keep going. He put the folder back in the metal box. He put the metal box back behind the water heater. He went upstairs and he sat at the kitchen table, and Mia was updating the inventory. And Joy was drawing butterflies, and the evening light came through the boarded windows in thin strips of gold, and he looked at his family, and he felt the guilt settle into him like sediment dropping to the bottom of a still pond. Layer by layer, heavy and permanent in his. Part 12. Joy's Garden. Joy had been planting things, and Dylan found out on day 62 when he went to the rooftop garden at dawn and found a section of the bed near the chimney that looked different. The soil was disturbed, mounded, arranged in small, neat rows like a child's version of his vegetable beds. He crouched and looked at what was growing, small green shoots pushing up through the dark soil. Delicate, almost pretty, but wrong. The color was too deep. The leaves were shaped like no plant he'd ever seen, and he'd spent 35 years around plants. They curled inward like fists, and the veins in them were dark, and they pulsed. He dug, carefully, with his fingers. The first thing he found was a finger, a human finger. Small, blackened at the severed end, buried in the soil about 3 inches down. The green shoot was growing from the knuckle joint. He dug more. A tooth, 2 teeth, a fragment of jawbone, a tuft of hair with the scalp still attached. All of them buried in the soil in neat rows, all of them sprouting, the green shoots rising from them with the determined vitality of weeds in a sidewalk crack. Joy was behind him. She'd followed him up the stairs with the silence of a child who knows she's been discovered. "I'm growing them back," she said. "What?" "The people, the ones who died. I found the pieces near the fence, the ones the infected left. I planted them because that's what you do. You put things in the ground and they grow." He looked at his daughter. 8 years old. 8 years old, and she had been collecting the remains of the dead and planting them in the garden because in her world things that went into the ground came back. Seeds became plants. Bulbs became flowers. And in the logic of a child traumatized by death and isolation, the bodies of the dead could be planted and grown into new people. Into friends. "Baby," he said, "that's not how it works." "It is working. Look, they're growing." She was right. They were growing. The virus in the organic material was doing something in the soil, using it, feeding on it, producing these wrong green shoots that were neither plant nor human but something in between. And they were spreading. The roots had extended beyond Joy's little garden beds and were reaching into the tomato soil and the bean soil and the herb soil, and everywhere they touched, the other plants were dying. Turning dark, curling inward. Dylan pulled them out, all of them, every shoot and every root and every buried fragment of human remains. And he pulled them out with his bare hands and put them in a bucket and carried the bucket to the burn zone and poured gasoline on it and lit it and stood there watching it burn while Joy stood on the roof and cried. It was the first time she'd cried since the outbreak. Not when the infected came. Not when the people at the gate were turned away. Not when the woman with the baby walked into the wheat. But this, the destruction of her garden, her attempt to grow something human in a world that was eating humanity alive, this broke her. Dylan held her on the roof after the bucket stopped burning, and he held her and she cried into his shirt, and he smelled her hair, which smelled like shampoo they were running low on, and like the particular sweetness of a child who hadn't bathed in days because water was rationed, and he thought about what the virus was doing, not to the world, to her. To the child who had once collected butterflies and now collected the remains of the dead and tried to grow them into friends. "I'm sorry," he said. "They were my garden." "I know. I just wanted someone to talk to. You can talk to me. You don't talk back. You just watch the fence." She was right. He'd become the fence, a perimeter, a barrier, a thing that kept danger out and everything else in. And he held his daughter and he promised himself that he would be more than a fence. And he knew even as he made the promise that the new world would not allow it. The new world demanded fences. It demanded walls and gates and locked doors and the man who stood behind them with a weapon and a willingness to use it. That man could not also be a father. Not fully. Not the way fathers were supposed to be. He replanted the contaminated section of the garden with fresh soil from the yard. He checked the remaining plants for the dark veins of infection. Most were clean. The tomatoes nearest to Joy's garden were compromised, and he pulled them and burned them and planted new seeds that would not produce anything edible before fall, and by fall they might all be dead anyway. Part 13. The Endless Harvest. The flour was poisoned. All of it. Every sack in every cellar in every house in the village. The wheat that Harold Knox had milled before the outbreak. The wheat from the Agricor modified seed stock. The wheat that had been planted and grown and harvested and ground and stored and eaten by everyone in the county. Dylan figured it out on day 67. He'd been reading the Agricor document again. The part about the viral vector, the part about the dormancy period, the part about activation triggers. He read it in the basement by flashlight because the solar panels were having a bad day and the battery reserve was low, and he read it with the growing certainty of a man assembling a puzzle and finding that the picture it forms is a picture of his own house on fire. The viral vector was heat-activated, not the kind of heat that cooking generated, a lower, slower heat. The heat of fermentation, of sourdough starter rising, of bread dough proofing in a warm kitchen. The virus was designed to be dormant in raw grain and to activate when the grain was processed into flour and mixed with water and warm yeast and allowed to rise. Every loaf of bread baked from the modified wheat was a delivery system. Every person who ate it was a host. The incubation period varied. Some people turned in days, others in weeks, and some, the document suggested, might carry the dormant virus for months. Asymptomatic, normal, alive and healthy and unaware that the thing inside them was waiting for a second trigger that the document did not specify. Mia's inventory said they had 38 pounds of flour remaining, most of it from Harold's mill, all of it from the local wheat harvest. All of it potentially contaminated. He went to the root cellar and stood in front of the flour sacks, and he thought about the bread he'd baked in the first week, the bread they'd all eaten. He thought about the numbers on Mia's spreadsheet and how those numbers now included a variable that could not be calculated. He thought about Joy eating toast for breakfast 3 days ago, and about the virus inside the wheat and the wheat inside the flour and the flour inside his daughter. He told Mia he had to. There was no way to address this without her knowing. He showed her the document and the timeline and the temperature data, and he watched her face as she read it, and her face did nothing because Mia's face never did anything when she was processing information. It just went still, like a computer screen while the hard drive was working. How much did we eat?" she said. "I don't know exactly. 10, maybe 12 pounds of the local flour. And the rest? The rest is in the cellar, along with the Agricor samples, the enhanced bars, the enhanced flour. So half our remaining food supply is potentially contaminated." "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. She looked at the spreadsheet. She looked at the inventory list. She looked at the numbers that had been her armor against the chaos, and the numbers were broken now. Half the food was poison. The timeline to starvation had just been cut in half. "We burn it," Dylan said. "All of it?" "All the wheat products, all the Agricor samples, everything." Mia. She closed the notebook. She opened it again. She wrote a new number at the top of the page, 31. She circled it. She looked at Dylan, and in her eyes he saw the thing she never showed. The thing behind the numbers. The woman who had held their daughter as a newborn and counted her fingers and toes and felt the same irrational love that every parent feels, and who was now being told that the man she loved had inadvertently helped poison the world, and that half their food was killing them slowly, and that their daughter might already be carrying the thing that turned people into plants that bit. "We burn it," she said. "Tonight." They burned it in the backyard at midnight. Every sack of flour, every Agricor product, every grain-based item that could be traced to the local supply. And the fire was bright and hot, and it sent a column of sparks into the sky that could probably be seen for miles, and Dylan didn't care because the alternative was eating the thing that was ending the world. He watched the flour burn, and he thought about the homestead, the house he'd built, the system he'd created, the YouTube empire of self-reliance and farm-to-table living. All of it built on a foundation that was rotten. Built on sponsorship money from a company that had engineered a plague. Built on wheat that was poison. Built on a lie so big that it had swallowed the world. "We have to leave," he said. Mia looked at him. "Leave?" "The homestead, the house, all of it. If the wheat in the fields is contaminated, then the soil is contaminated. The groundwater might be contaminated. Everything we've built here is built on top of the source. Where would we go? I don't know. But we can't stay." Joy was at the window, always at the window, watching the fire, watching her parents standing in the yard with the smoke rising and the sparks climbing and the world getting smaller and darker with every passing night. Part 14. Burn the field. The decision to burn the homestead came on day 70. It came not as a dramatic realization, but as the final entry on a spreadsheet that had been trending toward zero for weeks. The numbers were done. The food was done. The defensible perimeter was compromised by contaminated soil and contaminated water. And the 31 days Mia had calculated were now 23, and the trajectory was clear. They would die here if they stayed, slowly, quietly. Not from the infected at the fence or the mimics calling their names in the dark. From the wheat, from the earth itself, from the thing that had been planted in the ground before any of them knew there was anything to fear. Dylan made the plan, methodical, precise, the way he used to plan a tasting menu. Start with the foundation, build upward, every element serving a purpose, every action connected to the next. They would take what was clean, the rice, the canned goods, the seeds that Mia had verified came from pre-Agricor stock. The original heirloom varieties Dylan had ordered from a catalog in Vermont 3 years ago. Untouched, unmodified, clean. They would burn the rest, the house, the cellar, the contaminated stores, the Agricor documents, all of it, scorched earth. And leave nothing that someone else could find and eat and carry the virus forward. This was not just survival. This was responsibility. The last moral act of a man who had helped spread the plague and who could at least stop it from spreading further from this one point on the map. Mia agreed. She agreed in her way, which was to open a new spreadsheet and title it Departure, and begin listing the items they would take organized by weight and caloric value and probability of need. "I'll stay," she said. She said it on the second day of packing while they were in the cellar sorting canned goods. "What?" "Someone has to manage the burn, make sure it's complete. The contaminated stores have to be fully destroyed. If you leave them partially burned, someone could salvage them. We all leave together. The math doesn't work. In 3 people moving with full packs through infected territory. 1 adult carrying the weapons, 1 adult carrying supplies, 1 child. If something happens to you, I can't defend and carry. If something happens to me, you can't carry everything and defend. One of us stays, manages the burn, buys time. That's not buying time, that's dying. Everything is dying, Dylan. The question is what you trade it for." He looked at her, the woman who counted everything, who tracked every calorie and every bullet and every drop of water with the precision of a machine, and who had just calculated the value of her own life against the probability of her family's survival and found the trade acceptable. The numbers worked, the math was sound, and the math was monstrous, and he hated it, and he knew she was right. "Joy needs her mother," he said. "Joy needs to survive. You're better equipped for that than I am. You can hunt. You can build. You can fight. I can count things. Counting things won't keep her alive out there. It's kept us alive in here. In here is ending. They didn't resolve it that night, or the next. But the conversation had changed something. A weight had shifted. A calculation had been made. And Dylan walked through the house that he had built, and he looked at the walls and the windows and the garden on the roof, and he began the work of letting go of it the way a man lets go of a rope that's been holding him above a long fall. Finger by finger, knuckle by knuckle, until there's nothing left to hold. Part 15. The Last Supper. Devin came on day 73. And he came at dawn with 8 men and 2 trucks, and he came to the gate, and he stood there with his good teeth and his reasonable voice, and he said, "We need to talk about resources." Dylan was on the roof, Mossberg in hand. 5 rounds left. The Ruger was with Mia in the house. Connor was in the barn. "Nothing to talk about," Dylan said. "I think there is. You've been here a long time. You've got solar, water, structure. We've been watching. I know you have. So you know this doesn't have to be ugly. You join us, share the homestead, pool resources, everybody wins." "Nobody wins, and I'm not joining anything." Devin's smile didn't change. It was the smile of a man who had closed 1,000 deals and who had never met a no he couldn't convert to a yes. "You've got a kid in there, a wife. You really want to do this the hard way?" "The hard way is the only way left." "That's not true. There's community, cooperation, division of labor. I've got 26 people in those silos working, producing. We're building something." "You're bleeding them dry, literally." The smile thinned. For the first time since he'd arrived at the gate, Devin's mask slipped, and behind it was something cold and flat and efficient. The face of a man who had always seen other people as resources to be allocated. "Blood keeps us clean," Devin said. "That's science." "That's not science. That's you being a parasite with a medical kit." "Last chance. Open the gate. We'll be reasonable." "I've got 5 shotgun rounds and a knife that's been through more than you can imagine. I come through that gate and I'll show you what reasonable looks like." Devin left. He took his men and his trucks and he left, and Dylan knew he would be back. A man like Devin didn't take no for an answer. A man like Devin saw refusal as delay, as a negotiation tactic, as something to be overcome with the right application of pressure. The fire started at midnight. Not Dylan's fire, not yet. Devin's fire. His men came from the south with torches, and they threw them over the fence into the dry grass of the yard, and the flames caught and spread, and the night went orange. And the infected at the fence turned toward the light, because light was the one thing that held their attention even in the dark. Dylan was already moving. He'd planned for this. Not specifically for fire, but for a breach. For an assault. The go-bag was packed, and the supplies were staged by the back gate. Joy was in her shoes with her backpack on and her butterfly book inside, and her face was calm because she had learned that calm was what her father needed from her. And she would give it to him because she loved him. And because love in the new world looked like obedience and readiness and the suppression of every natural impulse to scream. "Get Joy out the back," Dylan said to Mia. "North along the ditch. There's a tree line a quarter mile out. Wait there." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." He wouldn't be right behind her. They both knew it. He was going to the silos. He was going to end this because if he didn't end it, Devin would follow them, would hunt them, would find them. A man like Devin didn't stop. Connor went with Mia and Joy, and Dylan had given him the Ruger and 16 rounds and instructions that were simple. "Get them to the tree line. If I'm not there by dawn, keep going north. And if you don't come back, then I don't come back." He went south, through the yard where the fire was spreading, through the gate, into the night. The Mossberg had 5 rounds and the Wusthof had 12 inches of German steel, and he moved through the dark with the economy of motion that comes from knowing exactly what you're going to do and exactly what it's going to cost. The silo complex was lit up. Devon's men had a generator running and the lights cast hard shadows across the steel cylinders and the gravel yard between them. Most of the men were gone, out at Dylan's homestead, setting fires, playing soldier. Devon had kept 2 with him. Guards, and standing at the main silo door with rifles. Dylan came from the east, through the burn zone, across the black field of ash where the corn had been and where the remains of the infected still lay like sculpture in a museum of the end of the world. He moved silent over the charred earth and the ash muffled his footsteps, and he came up behind the first guard and used the knife. It was quiet, efficient, the same motion he'd used 10,000 times on the cutting board. A draw cut, deep and fast, and the guard went down without a sound. The second guard turned at the wrong moment, and Dylan fired the Mossberg from 20 feet, and the man dropped, and the sound rolled across the flat landscape, and inside the silo the captives started screaming. Devon came out of the office trailer at a run. He had a machete, a big one, the kind you'd buy at an army surplus store, and he held it like a man who had practiced with it and who liked the weight of it in his hand. He saw Dylan standing in the light with the Mossberg and the blood on his hands, and his face and Devon's teeth caught the light when he smiled. There he is, the YouTube farmer, the content creator. You know what you are. You're a brand, and brands don't survive the end of the world. Neither do parasites. They circled each other in the gravel yard between the silos. The generator hummed. The lights buzzed. Inside the main silo, the captives were banging on the door, and somewhere north the homestead was burning, and the orange glow of it touched the underside of the clouds. Devon came in fast, and the machete was long, and he had reach, and he swung it in a horizontal arc that would have taken Dylan's head off if Dylan hadn't ducked. But Dylan had spent 12 years in kitchens where space was tight and timing was everything, and the movement of a blade through space was as familiar to him as breathing. He ducked. He stepped inside the arc. He cut. The Wüsthof went through Devon's forearm, and Devon screamed, and the machete hit the gravel, and Dylan kicked it away, and Devon grabbed for him with his good hand, and they went down together in the dirt. Close. Grappling. Devon was bigger and stronger and desperate, and he got a hand on Dylan's throat and squeezed, and Dylan's vision started to close, and he thought about Joy and Mia in the tree line a quarter-mile north, and he brought the knife up between them and drove it in. And Devon made a sound, not a word, just a sound. The sound of a man who had always believed he would come out on top and who was experiencing for the first and last time the feeling of being wrong. He looked at Dylan with an expression that was almost confused, almost offended, like death was a contractual violation he hadn't agreed to. Dylan pulled the knife out, and Devon fell, and Dylan stood up in the gravel yard with the silo lights buzzing overhead and the homestead burning on the horizon and the blood on his hands and his shirt and his face, and he unlocked the main silo door, and the captives came out. 14 of them, thin, pale, marked with the bruises of Devon's system. "Go," Dylan said. "North. Stay off the roads." They went. They didn't thank him, and he didn't expect thanks. And they went into the dark like animals released from a trap. And Dylan stood alone in the empty yard, and he breathed. The silo behind him groaned. The fire from the homestead had jumped. Embers carried on, the wind had landed on the dry grass around the complex, and the flames were climbing the steel walls of the nearest silo, and the metal was expanding in the heat and making sounds like a ship breaking apart in a storm. Dylan ran. He ran north across the gravel and the grass and the burn zone, and behind him the silo collapsed with a sound like God dropping a building. Part 16. Ash and Bone. He found them at the tree line, Mia and Joy and Connor, sitting in the dark among the oaks and the elms and watching the homestead burn. The house was fully engulfed, and the solar panels were warped and melting, and the roof garden was gone, and the walls were collapsing inward, and the sparks rose into the sky like a million tiny stars being born and dying in the same breath. Joy was in Mia's lap, not sleeping, just still, watching the fire with those quiet, observant eyes. Connor stood up when Dylan came through the trees. "You're alive, apparently. Devon?" "No." Connor nodded. He didn't ask for details. Some things in the new world came in the form of a single word and a nod, and that was enough. Dylan sat down next to Mia. She was holding Joy and looking at the fire, and her notebook was in her lap, and it was closed. For the first time since the outbreak, Mia's notebook was closed. The numbers were done. The inventory was done. Everything they'd tracked and counted and rationed and managed was burning a quarter-mile away, and there was nothing left to count. "Mia," he said, "I know. We have to go. I know." She paused. "I'm staying." "No. The contaminated stores, the cellar. If the fire doesn't reach them, someone will find them, eat them, spread it further. The fire will reach them. Will it? The cellar is concrete, 6 inches of reinforced concrete. Fire burns hot, but it burns fast. If the structure collapses and smothers the fire, the cellar could survive intact, with everything in it." He looked at her. She was right. The cellar had been built to survive a tornado. It might survive a house fire, and inside it were the remaining contaminated stores and the Agricore documents and the whole poisoned foundation of their former life. "I'll make sure," Mia said. "I'll go back. I'll make sure the cellar burns completely, then I'll follow." "You won't follow." "I might." "You won't." She looked at him. The fire reflected in her eyes, and for the first time in a long time he saw her. Not the accountant, not the logistician, not the woman with the spreadsheet. The woman, the mother, the person who had held everything together with numbers because numbers were the only thing strong enough to hold, and who had now done the final calculation and found that her own survival was the only number she was willing to subtract. "Take care of the numbers," she said. She kissed Joy's forehead. She kissed Dylan. She stood up and she handed him the notebook, and she walked toward the fire. "Mia." She didn't turn around. "Mia." She walked, steady, purposeful, into the light of the burning homestead, into the heat and the smoke and the sparks. She walked the way she did everything, with precision, with certainty, with the absolute conviction that the math was right. Dylan held Joy and watched his wife walk into the fire, and Joy pressed her face against his chest and said, "She's going to fix it." "Yeah, baby, she's going to fix it." They watched until the house collapsed completely, until the roof fell in and the walls folded and the whole structure went down in a roar of flame and timber, and the sparks rose higher than they'd risen before, and the heat pushed them back deeper into the trees. Connor touched Dylan's shoulder. We need to go." Dylan stood. He picked up Joy and put her on his hip, and he picked up the pack with the clean food and the seeds and the remaining ammunition, and he turned north and he walked into the dark of the tree line, and behind him the homestead burned and the silos burned and the wheat fields glowed in the reflected light. And the world that he had built and lost and burned was a memory now. A number in a closed notebook. A line item in a ledger that no one would ever read. One more winter they walked for 3 days, north through the flattened Ohio landscape, along back roads and field edges and the corridors of dead corn and burned wheat. The infected were sparse now, and the ones they encountered stood in the fields in small groups with their green skin and their white eyes. And they didn't move during the day, and at night Dylan and Joy sheltered in barns and abandoned houses, and once in a church where the pews were overturned and the windows were broken and the cross above the altar still hung there, catching the moonlight like a message from someone who had stopped sending messages a long time ago. Connor left on the 2nd day. He went east, toward Pennsylvania, toward whatever was left of Pittsburgh or beyond it. "You could come with us," Dylan said. "I'm not a farmer. I'm not a father. You don't need me where you're going." "Where am I going?" "Somewhere that grows." They shook hands. And Connor walked east with the Ruger and 8 rounds in the camera bag he still carried, because some habits define a man even when the world that created those habits no longer exists. Dylan watched him go, and then he turned north and Joy held his hand and they kept walking. Winter came early. The first frost hit in late September, and by October the trees were bare and the fields were brown, and the cold came down out of Canada like a knife and settled into the Ohio landscape with the patience of something that intended to stay. Dylan found a farmhouse, empty, solid. Far enough from the contaminated wheat belt to feel like a fresh start. He boarded the windows and cleaned the chimney and started a fire with wood from the woodpile someone had left stacked against the barn, and the warmth of it filled the kitchen, and Joy sat on the floor in front of it with her butterfly book, and her face was orange in the firelight, and she looked up at him and almost smiled. The winter was hard. They ate canned food and rice, and the rabbits Dylan caught in wire snares, and the occasional deer that came close enough for the Mossberg, which still had 2 rounds because ammunition was forever and he would not waste it. They melted snow for water. They slept close for warmth. Dylan taught Joy to build a fire and to set a snare and to identify which plants in the frozen landscape would be edible come spring. He told her about the kitchens, about étoiles, about plating the perfect dish and the satisfaction of feeding someone something beautiful. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, silently, filing it away. She asked about Mia once, in January. They were sitting by the fire and the wind was howling outside and the house creaked around them like a ship at sea. "Is Mom coming?" "No, baby. She went back to fix the numbers." "She did. Did she fix them?" "Yeah, she fixed them." Joy was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Good," and she went back to her book. Spring came the way spring always comes to Ohio, slow and tentative, and then all at once, and the snow melted and the ground softened, and the first green shoots appeared in the yard, and Dylan stood on the porch of the farmhouse and looked at them and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not hope. Something more careful than hope. Something more disciplined. The simple biological fact that things grow. That sunlight and water and soil do what they have always done, regardless of what the creatures walking the earth above them have done to each other and to themselves. He opened the pack. The seeds were there. The heirloom varieties, the clean ones. Unmodified, unengineered. Seeds from a world before agricor and viral vectors and the particular arrogance of men who thought they could improve on a system that had been working for 10,000 years. He held a seed in his palm, a wheat seed, original, pre-modification, as old and simple as agriculture itself. He rolled it between his fingers and he thought about planting it. About the wheat it would grow into and the flour that wheat would make and the bread that flour would become. He thought about the cycle. Seed to soil to stalk to grain to flour to bread to body. The oldest story, the first story, the one that every civilization had been built on and that one civilization had corrupted, and that maybe, if he was careful, if he was humble, if he remembered what the cost of forgetting was, he could start again. Joy came out onto the porch. She was holding the butterfly book, but she was looking at the yard, at the green, at the spring. "Are we planting?" she said. "Yeah, we're planting." "The good seeds?" "The good seeds." She looked at him, those quiet eyes, in the eyes that had seen the infected and the fire and the blood and the fence and the people turned away and the mother who walked into the flames. The eyes that saw everything and understood more than any child should have to understand. "How do we know they're good?" she said. He looked at the seed in his hand. The oldest question. The question that had started everything and that would start everything again. How do you know what you're planting? How do you know what will grow? How do you know that the thing you put in the ground won't rise up and consume you? "We don't," he said. "We plant them anyway. And we watch. And we're careful. And we don't make the same mistakes." She nodded, and she came down the porch steps and she stood in the yard with the spring sun on her face. And she held out her hand for a seed, and he gave her one, and she knelt in the soft earth and pushed it into the ground with her thumb, and she covered it with soil. And she stood up and she looked at the tiny mound, and she looked at her father, and she said, "Okay." Dylan knelt next to her. He pushed a seed into the ground, and then another, and another, row by row in the warm spring soil of a new place in a ruined world. Planting the oldest thing, the simplest thing, the thing that had fed humanity since before there were cities or nations or YouTube channels or sponsorship deals or viruses engineered in laboratories. Just seed and soil and sun and the patient, disciplined hope of a man who had lost everything and was starting again. And if you're still alive out there, if you're hearing this, don't plant what you don't understand. Don't trust what you haven't grown yourself. Don't eat the bread of strangers. Start with the good seeds. Start small. Start careful, and watch what grows. This is Dylan Reeves, somewhere in Ohio. Spring of whatever year this is. The wheat is in the ground. My daughter's hands are dirty. The sun is up. We're still here.